One of the biggest goals of the NC State Soybean Extension Program is to help growers in this state narrow the yield gap, which we'll define as the statewide average yield, which usually floats around 35 bushels per acre, and what's attainable based on the soybean yield contest, which is anywhere from 65 to 80 bushels per acre on average. We've done a recent analysis of 877 entries into the NC Soybean Yield Contest over the past 18 years. And we looked at the various management factors, excluding fertility, that went into managing the plots that were entered in that contest. And of those management factors, what do you think were the biggest predictors of soybean yield?
Planting date.
Population.
Planting date.
Row spacing, planting date. The single biggest predictor of soybean yield was maturity group, with maturity group 4 or less providing a yield advantage over the use of later maturing varieties. The next biggest predictor of soybean yield was the use of a foliar fungicide. Less than 50% of our entries into the contest used a foliar fungicide. Generally, the use of a foliar fungicide led to yield benefits. And the final biggest predictor was planting date, with earlier planting dates often providing a yield advantage. The trial that we have behind us here is funded by the North Carolina Soybean Producers Association, where we're looking at 2 of those 3 biggest predictors of yield in the soybean yield contest, maturity group and planting date. And we're looking at how these can be optimized to increase soybean yields in North Carolina. I'm going to have the graduate student, Mr. Tristan Morris, who's managing this project across the state, talk about the logistics of what we have going on here in Beaufort County and across the state.
I'm a graduate student with the Soybean Extension Research Program this year, and today we're at my plots in Beaufort County. Here we're looking at planting date by maturity group, by seeding rate. Last year we had a study very similar to this. Across the state, and over in Hyde County was one of the locations last year, and this year we're here in Beaufort County. A little difference this year, we have fewer planting dates, with 5 planting dates here at this location, and across the state we're also located in Salisbury at the Piedmont Research Station and in Robeson County. So here today at these plots, the 5 different planting dates ranging from early April to mid-July. There are 5 different seeding rates from 75,000 all the way up to 175,000. And there are 7 different maturity groups, from a maturity group 2 to a late group 7. So at each of my locations this year, data collection consists of stand counts once the beans have emerged. And then we record the R1, we want to see when those beans start to flower, and at that time we will put on a fungicide, insecticide, and herbicide application at that time, and then we'll come back later in the year and harvest the different maturity groups as they reach full maturity. Also at harvest we take a subsample of each plot, and we're going to test each sample for quality. So we're looking at damage and then also at the protein and oil content of the seed. Also here at the plot today and at our other locations, we are collecting weather data, and that'll be important when we go back to analyze our yield and to see how weather affected the different maturity groups, and especially during pod fill, how our weather impacted our yield. So this project here today is part of my thesis work, and I hope to graduate in May of 2021. I would like to thank the Soybean Producers Association for funding the research here, and I also like to thank the growers across the state for hosting my research and being a great support.
Our purpose with this research is to create a grower decision support tool where a grower could plug in their desired planting date and it would spit out the optimal maturity group and seeding rate to use at this planting date. To create a tool that is robust, we need to do this research for 4 or 5 years. And I'll give you an example of why. Let's think about May 2019. It was hot, very hot and dry for several weeks. Let's think about May 2020. Wet and abnormally cool. So that's going to influence the results that we see in this trial. There's going to be year-to-year variability. But we want to do this over enough years that we can make the recommendations on average. So even though we don't want to focus too much on one individual year, we can talk about some highlights from what we saw in 2019. The first interesting thing that we did in 2019 was we planted in the middle of March and into late March. So we had some really early planting dates. Sometimes it took those beans 20 to 25 days to emerge, but eventually they did, and we had respectable stands. Our highest yielding planting date scenarios from last year were planting from late April into about the third week of May. We saw lower yields with our really early March planting dates last year, and I think one of the reasons is those soybeans, earliest planted soybeans last year in the early maturity groups, were flowering in the middle of May. So they started flowering into those unfavorable conditions where it was very hot and dry. We'll be very curious to see this year how our early April planting dates compare to our late April and May planting dates. Across those highest yielding planting dates last year, our highest yielding maturity groups were maturity group 4 and 5. And those were the highest yield across quite a wide range in planting dates, all the way into a double crop situation where we still saw the highest yielder being a maturity group 4. We're excited to see what our results are this year from this site and sites across the state, because we know there's a lot of interest in the use of an earlier maturing variety, even in later planting situations. So we're curious to see if this year we see similar results as last year, where the maturity groups 4 and 5 were the highest yielders across planting dates. We're also looking at a variety of seeding rates within each planting date and maturity group combination. We still get a lot of questions from growers about how to adjust their seeding rates as planting date is delayed. And preliminary data from this trial might even indicate that different planting seeding rates are needed for different maturity groups. So we look forward to generating more information on that. So right here we're in front of our early April planting date. Our maturity group 2 soybeans are at R6, our full seed. Last year we started harvest in the first week of August. I'm guessing we'll be a slightly later than that this year, but these maturity groups 2 planted at the beginning of April will likely be ready for harvest within a month. We go all the way down to our maturity group 7 late that were planted at the beginning of April, and those soybeans have just started to flower. These maturity groups 2 planted in early April started to flower June 6th. Last year we were able to plant early enough that soybeans were flowering in the middle of May, but I think the cooler, wet conditions in May 2020 slowed growth enough that we didn't see early flowering until the beginning of June. So one of the most interesting things we've seen at our Beaufort County site in 2020 is that in this early April planting date, we've had a lot of kudzu bug pressure. A couple weeks ago, we noticed there was a tremendous amount of kudzu bug nymphs on the plants at this earliest planting date, and so we made an insecticide application last week. This week, July 10th, we saw that the fungus that naturally controls kudzu has appeared on these plants. And after talking to our entomologist, Dr. Dominic Reising, that should knock out the kudzu bug pressure. But that's one of the things that we saw with our earliest planting date this year at this site that we didn't see with some of the later planting dates. We've got a tremendous canopy, both with our early April, late April, and even our late May planted soybeans at this site. So we're looking forward to generating more data for the Blackland growers. And we appreciate the support from the North Carolina soybean producers to support growers across the state by trying to provide more robust recommendations on maturity group use as we move across these planting dates. One of our major concerns with these early maturity groups, which will be ready for harvest in August, that are planted early, is that there could be quality issues. So one of the data points that we're capturing in this study is we're quantifying damage similar to the way damage is quantified by the NCDA when growers take their samples to the elevator. And so we take these samples and we look for damage levels. And last year we did see quite high levels of damage with maturity groups 2 and 3 that were planted early April or before. As we push planting date into early May, the damage that we saw in these earlier maturing varieties declined quite dramatically. So when are growers often trying to get their soybeans to flower? By the longest day of the year, or the summer solstice, and the goal is to capitalize on the maximum photosynthesis that you have on the longest day of the year. So one thing that we noticed in 2019 across a lot of our planting date and maturity group combinations was that the highest yielding maturity group at those planting dates was often flowering around the longest day of the year, or the middle of June. So we continue to collect information about flowering dates throughout these plots, and I'll highlight an excellent tool that was developed out of the University of Arkansas called SoyStage that you can use to plug in your soybean emergence date and maturity group to try to predict when those soybeans will be flowering. So you can see here that these maturity groups 2 and 3 planted at the beginning of April will likely be ready for harvest in the middle of August. They're already at the R6 full seed growth stage. And one consideration that North Carolina growers need to think about is soybean quality when you've got soybeans that are coming into physiological maturity under such harsh environmental conditions of heat and humidity. In 2019, we saw a lot of damage in our soybeans that were planted early and that were early maturing varieties. As we push planting date into early May, damage levels declined quite dramatically with some of these earlier maturing 2, 3, and 4 varieties planted in the state. So at Hyde County last year, we had a small subset of this trial. We had 2 planting dates, an early April and a late April planting date. What did we see in Hyde County? Well, at that early April planting date, we saw the highest yields from a maturity group 4 and 5. And one of those reasons is because we saw quite a lot of damage with the maturity groups 2 and 3 planted early in Hyde County last year. As we push planting date into late April, we saw similar yields amongst the maturity groups 3, 4, and 5 at that planting date, and we saw much less damage, especially of the maturity group 3 as we pushed planting date a little bit later in April. So one of the key management practices that growers in the Blacklands are doing to successfully manage these early maturing varieties is they're often using a fungicide to help protect seed quality. Rod Gerganis in Beaufort County is going to be doing some research this year on using fungicides in early maturing varieties to try to generate some more information in conjunction with what we're doing on the statewide level to support growers that are interested in adopting early maturing varieties but know that protecting seed quality is going to be a critical issue. We want to express our gratitude to the North Carolina Soybean Producers Association for supporting this research. We're excited about what a few years of planting date maturity group data can do for our ability to make robust recommendations to growers across the state. We also want to express gratitude to our hosts across these sites. These are very large trials and it's a big effort for the host agent and the host grower to accommodate these trials, so we're very grateful to all the county agents and the Blackland growers for supporting the program.